Why do we use the spectrum as a metaphor for what autism is? I think we use metaphors of all kinds to describe different aspects of our life. They're innumerable. You could think of your growth as a tree, that you grow from a seed to a fully grown tree. You could look at nature as a machine with different moving parts, or as a legal system, as if there's natural laws and natural rights, looking at things through the lens of nature. And to a certain extent, these things are described using metaphors, or the classic Platonic cave, where you emerge from the shadows, just looking at shadows on a wall, to the sun, which is supposed to be the forms, the Platonic forms. And these are metaphors, and they're interesting. But I think sometimes we have these images in our head for what something is. We think that these images are more real than the thing that they're describing. The linguistic tools become confused for something else that they're just a tool for. And I think sometimes that autism as a spectrum is interpreted in a way that prevents us from seeing what autism really is with our own minds. For example, the idea that everybody is on the spectrum oftentimes takes this metaphor and applies it in a way that dissolves the differences between autistic people and other types of people. Although our essence as autistic people may vary greatly. For example, there are autistic people who have ADHD, or autistic people who also have BPD, or autistic people who have schizophrenia, or different intellectual abilities. And to a certain extent, the spectrum emphasizes these differences because a spectrum has all these different colors, so the breadth, the variation is emphasized, that there's all different kinds of symptoms that people with autism have. But I do not think that the spectrum metaphor is intended to say that there's no such thing as autism and that everybody is autistic, because autism is different than a lot of other ways people perceive. People who are autistic view the world in their own way, and each individual autistic person has their own differences. So when we rely on this metaphor, it's easy for it to be turned against its intention. The intention of the community itself, rather than the will of other people who want to interpret autism in a way that is more neurotypical. But then it's important to acknowledge deep down that what we consider neurotypical and neurodiverse is dependent on how people see themselves. There's probably plenty of people who are autistic who would consider themselves neurotypical because they don't have the self-awareness to realize that they are autistic, or they haven't been diagnosed and they don't have that kind of awareness. So to that extent, to the extent that there's people who are in that position, their reality is that they have these neurodiverse behaviors and expressions, but they want to believe that they're not that way. And the spectrum metaphor, I guess, would apply to them, even though they might not identify that way. So people in that position probably might be included or feel like they're included through the interpretation that all people are a little autistic, because they don't identify as autistic, but deep down they have this repressed neurodivergence, repressed disability. So the interpretation of everybody being on the spectrum will appeal to some people in that position. But for people who need accommodations, for people who have been discriminated against because they're lumped in to the mass of normality when they need some type of acknowledgement that they have differences in what they can do and differences in how they perceive the world that leads to them suffering when they're unacknowledged. Acknowledging them is important, and the idea that everybody's on the spectrum can seem invalidating to their differences. And the conventions are important. I don't think that ignoring conventional reality necessarily corresponds to the needs of autistic people. But one of the most pressing difficulties in the community is our arguments over what things mean, the semantics of what autism is, what it isn't. The discourse becomes a source of agitation, a source of trauma, rather than a place for connection. Because even within our group of people who identify as autistic and want to better connect with the world, better connect with themselves, live in a society that accepts our differences rather than forces us to repress them. We don't get along all the time, online, in person, and we may express our differences and even resentments differently online or versus being in person, depending on our relationships. And sometimes I think the spectrum metaphor is a great benefit to being able to communicate our variations. But I also think it can be a problem when it's seem weaponized against us, or like become something that doesn't explain what we want to explain. The intention of it to explain something becomes ineffectual. It doesn't work. So deep down for me, I use the spectrum metaphor when I feel like it's useful to explain to others. But the way I see my own mind as an autistic person is with no metaphors at all. I don't really believe deep down, other than as a tool of communication, that the metaphor is more real than my own meditation of my own mind and perception of the phenomena going on in my mind. I have all kinds of disabilities, and I have abilities, and the essence of who I am as a person can't be explained with any form of metaphor, because the essence of who I am, even the just if I could isolate that part of me that's autistic from everything else, that would probably change over time. It would still have a certain flavor to it. It would maintain its character, but certain parts of it would change. And a metaphor I may use to explain myself today might be better explained with a different one, because my understanding of myself changes as I grow older. And I really believe that when we confuse our representational and linguistic tools for the experience of something itself, we become disconnected from ourselves. We don't even see ourselves without the metaphor in our minds. We're thinking about representations in our mind. But when we're doing that, sometimes we don't see the deeper causes, which may be social conventions. It may be something we're trying to control about ourselves, or something that doesn't get solved by clinging to the metaphor. For example, another metaphor that I'm openly critical of is flags as a national symbol, or the word of a nation. When we over-identify with the idea of us being in a group, like a nation, and we have this symbol, sometimes that symbol becomes like more real to us than the actual people that live near us, the people that we communicate with. So we start fighting over what symbols mean, like what a flag means, what like different rituals around the flag symbolize, rather than stuff that I feel like is more important. Sorry, I had to burp. Stuff that's more important, like our relationships with other people. Because at this time, people are just arguing over flags. In our American experience, people just argue about those things, and it becomes more real. It becomes hyper real in Baudrillard terms. It becomes the representation of a flag becomes more real than people, than the environment. And money is another symbol that's conventionally important. But when we take it too seriously, we start to confuse measuring value and our conventional ways of measuring what's valuable for other values which can't be measured. And this can become quite troublesome. And I think that the spectrum metaphor is great in certain ways. And I don't want to say I hate it. And I have a little bit more trouble not feeling bad about flags because it causes so much division in our country. At least the spectrum metaphor and symbol generally brings our community together and helps explain something that's deeper than itself. But it's sad to watch people on the internet and in real life suffer so much because they feel like they need other people to understand the spectrum metaphor, understand these things, when they will do everything to make it seem that you are just the exact same as them. And that is a lot of people's intention, is to only unify people into one mass at the expense of our needs. And the spectrum can sometimes be weaponized in that way because, oh, everyone's a little bit on the spectrum, and those metaphors that were meant to help us become other reasons that we need to be fixed or changed in ways that are ineffectual to our own health. And there's certain things that maybe we do want to change about ourselves, but I don't think I like the suffering I see when people argue about these kinds of semantics. It causes spinning in our own heads. And maybe our minds are so changing that deep down there is no metaphor, but we need to have metaphors to explain to other people what's going on in our minds because they're not autistic. Maybe the spectrum is more for charts, because you see all these charts online. There's like a rainbow wheel with like different traits, psychological or behavioral differences between different autistic people. There's these charts, and the charts are interesting and they can be helpful for people to understand autism. And there's charts like intersectional charts that show different types of oppression. And we try and use these things to compare. But maybe the autistic experience and all neurodiversity is beyond comparison. And this over-comparing different traits, different disabilities, becomes a source of suffering. That this comparison has a limit in its importance and efficacy. And after that point, it loses its value. And it's my opinion that the spectrum has a line as a metaphor where it loses its value. And I think all representations and metaphors lose its value when it starts to cause more controversy and debate about what it is, what's it supposed to represent. It becomes a meta-narrative, and these meta-narratives become worse as when they're clung to beyond their explanatory power. That's just my opinion. I don't hate all metaphors. I like using metaphors. I write poetry. Poetry is all metaphor, but I don't write poetry with the intention to cause people to fight over what something means. So that's my thoughts on the spectrum. Please share your comments and subscribe. I appreciate everyone who has watched my interviews and other videos, because I want to share my thoughts. I also want to get thoughts of other people. I just burped again, and goodbye.